Well, welcome to another episode of the Residential Developer Podcast. I'm the host, Nathan Battishall, and I'm bringing you a special episode off the back of all of our episodes around the LMR, the low rise, low and medium rise reforms policy that came in. I want to do an episode about what to look at before you buy a block in the LMR mapped area. So just to backtrack quickly, if you haven't watched the previous episodes, we've got about 3 or 4 episodes where we break down what this new low and mid-rise housing policy that came into effect, the Stage 2 reforms that came into effect at the end of Feb. We're now a few months down the road and a lot of people are snapping up blocks. They're looking at blocks. They're looking at the potential and the opportunity to take advantage of these areas. So if you haven't watched our previous episodes, make sure you backtrack. Go back a few episodes and you'll see a whole series of episodes where we talk about what this low and mid-rise policy means, what areas it's applicable in, and then we broke down the different types of developments being duplex, dual occupancy, terraces, units. We broke all of that down. So just for time's sake today, I'm not going to go back onto that. I want to encourage you, if you are looking to do developments under this, taking advantage of this new reform, this new policy, state policy that's come into effect for low and mid-rise developments, I want to encourage you to go back and listen to those episodes. In fact, you probably need to listen to them a couple of times. Take some notes, really get familiar with and get your head around these new reforms and what that means and what that looks like. But I want to do an episode today which is a little bit different, okay? This is a before you buy a block or before you buy a site in this LMR. I call it LMR, and that's sort of that's the short term that everyone's giving anything that's mapped within this new low to mid-rise area. Okay, so when you hear me say LMR, you're going to hear that's going to be a very common term. Anyone that wants to work and walk in this space is going to hear that word LMR. When you hear LMR, essentially what it's saying, it's an area that is mapped within that particular housing area. And again, once again, to help you, in the show notes, we'll put a link to the actual mapping so that you can check the particular site you own or you're looking at to determine if it is mapped within this low to mid-rise area. You'll see it'll be shown in brown, like a brown colour if it fits within that area. Then there's a whole bunch of different constraints you need to look at. So we're going to take a bit of a deep dive into some important things that you need to look at before you purchase a site within the LMR area. I've spoken to dozens and dozens of people already, probably close to 100 people at this point on these sites, and my staff have spoken to people within these particular areas. And unfortunately, we've already seen some people go ahead and buy sites without doing proper due diligence purely because it's mapped within that LMR area. And obviously some agents and different people in the industry have already caught on to what areas are within that LMR. So people are snapping up these sites left, right and centre, unfortunately snapping up some sites that hold serious constraints from a development point of view. So not only are some people paying overs or they're paying above market or they're competing on some of these sites, they're then securing and taking on sites that have constraints. So I just want to bring an episode just really helping people to really consume some of this content so that you can go in with your eyes wide open when you are looking at these type of sites. Obviously, every council's different, every area is different, even every suburb within a particular council can be different. So there's a whole bunch of different constraints, some that apply to certain councils, some that apply to others. It's a tricky one, especially if you are looking at multiple suburbs, multiple areas. For those who aren't, for those who are just tackling a suburb, an area, a LGA, it enables you to really drill down and get a good, strong understanding of what you need to look for. So it's impossible to do an episode where we could break down every single area, although I'd love to have an episode per suburb, per area. We would need a lot of time. So, but look, this is just a broad overview, some things I'm seeing, some things I'm hearing, some things that I'm finding, some flags that people are discovering in this new LMR. First and foremost, it's an exciting opportunity. In a period of time where we've probably gone through some tricky elements when it comes to doing projects, we saw obviously a big boom, then we saw inflation, we saw interest rates, we saw a whole bunch of things bring some elements of property to a bit of a halt, slowing down. We saw some record numbers of declines in approvals, in DAs, all that sort of thing. We saw that. But at the same time, this has created a new spark, a new opportunity. We've obviously come off the back of an election now, and people are obviously always cautious as to what that looks like, how that's going to play out. We are going to bring some episodes around what this new election means, what it could look like from a development point of view. We essentially just want to give you some tips and some tools before you buy a site in an LMR area. Now, first and foremost, and it sounds very self-explanatory, but unfortunately there are people that are very green in this space, and so the moment they get sold the fact that it's within an LMR area, therefore you can do more on the site, people snap it up without actually doing proper due diligence. So first and foremost, yes, you do need to make sure it is within that LMR area. There's a lot of confusion around. I've seen a lot of people, especially in places like Epping, Northern Beaches is a massive one where people are getting mistruths and they're hearing wrong information. So, for example, people who are not aware that you have to be within that mapped area. So some people just think that they're within 800 metres of a shopping centre or 800 metres of a train station or within a local centre. So they're not checking the mapping first and foremost. So that's the big thing first. Check that mapping, make sure you're within that LMR area, but also make sure that you are located within 800 metres of that train station or of that particular local centre that it's deemed. This is the information I've given. It can't be 800 metres from as the crow flies. It has to be an actual proper walking or driving distance. For example, if it's a train station, you have to show that you are within 800 metres. So that's a pretty key thing. So it's important to get that right and make sure that that's clear. So that's the first and foremost thing. But you also need to make sure, and this is where a lot of people are coming unstuck. And I think this is where, once again, I think a lot of policy comes through and gets a little bit rushed. The state government's mapped a lot of areas that are bushfire prone, flood prone, have a bunch of constraints that actually straight away disqualify development in that area. I'll use an example. One area in just north of Wollongong in Fairy Meadow. So there's a whole bunch of Fairy Meadow that's been mapped on the LMR for LMR, but if you turn on the flood overlay, there's a huge percentage of that area is actually flood affected. So although a lot of people have got excited and thought all of a sudden I can get a site that's a lot narrower and do potentially multi-dwelling on a site that you could maybe only do duplex, straight away in that particular area you can't do multi-dwelling because it's flood affected. And although a lot of areas might be low flood affection or very low, but the moment it's got any flood affection on the site, you cannot do, if you look in the SEP, there's parts of this LMR that straight away disqualify it, things like bushfire, flood affection. There's a whole bunch of different elements, and if you go back to a previous episode, I'll break that down in a lot more detail. But that is one of the biggest problems we're finding is people are not able to they're not checking those things. They're not able to do their due diligence to determine what constraints or what issues there are. And you will have seen we had Will from PropCode come in. They've developed an incredible AI tool that obviously can help you identify constraints on a site. So that's a great tool if you are looking for sites. If you're looking at sites, you can use tools like that. There's so many tools out there. Star, Sharky Star, there's the list goes on. There's great tools out there that you can use as a residential investor, developer, someone who wants to do property. So you can do those checks, or like what a lot of people do, they'll do some of their initial checks themselves. Then they've got someone on their team, whether it be a planner, experienced planner and designer, architect, who can really walk them through and help them really navigate what's achievable and what's possible. So that's a really big one. So first and foremost, making sure it is within that area, but there's a whole lot of other things that a lot of people are coming unstuck on, and just your typical things like with any development, that there's, although you may not have affection on the site, whether it be flood, bushfire, heritage, any of those things, so that could be all ticking the box. But then you've got to look at the actual constraints of the site. So what are you dealing with on the site? And although we saw that number that the state government announced, 170,000 sites have been unlocked now under the LMR, I love, like Will from PropCode, when he came on, talked about how it's probably actually about 120,000. But if you break it down even further, once you start to look at the constraints on the site, that 120 can even go further back, because a lot of sites, in order to unlock the potential on the site, you need to identify what constraints are you dealing with on the site. They may not be constraints that are impacting of the LMR, but there's constraints on a site that you have to navigate through via a DA or a CDC process. Now, some of these new sites that are unlocked, you can do CDCs, especially things like terraces, but a lot of these the new LMR elements will require a DA. Things like 12-metre wide blocks for duplexes, townhouses in R2 zones where you've not been able to do multi-dwelling in the past. There's a whole bunch of things where the only option you're going to have at this point of time is a DA through council. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that you need to site constraints that you can be dealing with from a DA point of view. Now, some common ones is the slope of the land. Although a lot of sites, if you look around the northern beaches, or if you look around Parramatta, for example, if you look around Ryde, if you look around elements of Wollongong, like sites all across New South Wales, especially within these LMR areas, you've got a lot of sites that slope backwards. Now, you need to make sure that you've engaged, or you've got a good stormwater engineer that understands that, council understands what's required. Most of these blocks are infill blocks, they're in established areas. Most of them don't have an easement for stormwater. So you have to look at the actual DCP for that council. What do their stormwater controls look like? All these councils will have a policy. They'll have a development control plan around stormwater, how you can deal with stormwater. If it's a backward sloping block, some councils let you do alternate systems, whether it be absorption or various systems. But a lot of councils, it's a flat out no. If it's a backward sloping block, the only option is to talk to the neighbour behind on the block that slopes to the street, and to negotiate an easement, which can obviously be time consuming, it can be stressful, it can be costly. And if you haven't acquired the site, that's straight away a bit of a game changer. If you have to get an easement, the best thing generally to do is to walk away from that site, unless you're able to somehow negotiate an easement, which is very rare, prior to the acquisition of that site. So that's a big one. Does the stormwater work? Already we're seeing a lot of people, unfortunately, and only as recently as this week I saw someone unfortunately come undone where they got talked into the wrong advice, didn't get any planning advice, went ahead and bought the property, and they can't drain it from a stormwater point of view. So that's a big one. It's a really big one. Then you've got your typical constraints like trees. A lot of these established areas, especially in those really low density areas where it's generally been like a just one large house, nice and leafy suburbs, large native trees, just nice and leafy. Very just that typical, one house type area. And there's a lot of these areas now that have been unlocked under the LMR, but the problem is there's a lot of sites that have large native trees, healthy large native trees. And although these areas have been unlocked for LMR to execute projects, whether it be duplexes, multi-dwelling, terraces, units, one of the biggest problems we're seeing is a lot of these sites have large numbers of native trees. Now, when you're dealing with that, just because it's mapped LMR does not necessarily mean that council is going to be supportive of the removal of those trees. And I said this in a previous episode, and I'll say it again. Not every council is over the moon on this new policy that's come about. Now, the power, to a lot of degrees, is still in the hands of council, okay, because a lot of these sites you can't execute a complying development. You have to go through the council DA pathway. So a lot of councils, you're dealing with councils, you're dealing with councillors, you're dealing with people that live on the streets, the neighbourhood, who are not over the moon, a lot of them, about areas of their community or their suburb or where they live or their street where all of a sudden, in the past, some of these areas you could only build one house. All of a sudden, some people have paid a lot of money for a beautiful old house or a nice house in this area, and all of a sudden Joe next door can buy the house next door and he can potentially knock it down and do 3 townhouses or do a duplex or do a development. People are not over the moon about this. So that's why it's very key, very, very key to make sure you do adequate and thorough diligence over the site, because just because it's mapped and LMR does not necessarily mean that it's going to be suitable. So a big one is trees. There's a lot of these sites, and I've been looking at these sites like constantly since Feb when this came out. Like, there's a lot of areas with very established trees in very healthy condition, in areas where people are not over the moon about this code. So that's where I think, again, that number, that 170,000 is just going down and down and down and down. And that's not to be a downer, but I think it's important to obviously we get sold this element of this 170,000 properties unlocked, but it's not the case. Like, once you start to break down a lot of constraints and controls and different things, that actually you start to lessen that down. And I say that for this purely only just to go in with your eyes wide open, and like any site, do your thorough due diligence and go in like fully open to the fact that you need to have your eyes open. Like any other typical control, you've just got to look at your typical checks. Like, does it slope backwards? Can it be drained from a stormwater point of view? Obviously, what's on the site? Is there native trees? Is there anything that's impacting that? Even on the site, like, what are you dealing with? Can you get driveway crossovers if it's a duplex? Can you get 2 driveway crossovers if only one's possible? Is there nothing in the middle that's going to hinder that? There's a lot of sites I'm seeing where there's large native trees, for example, on council land on the council strip. So you're in essentially then you're running risk. Like, if you need to do a duplex to make it work, but you've only got a driveway on one side, well, how are you going to access the garage on the other side? Are you relying on the removal of a tree that's a 50-50 or maybe not even that? So you're running risk. And again, everyone's got different risk profile, but I think it's smart to do thorough due diligence. Again, there's a lot of sites that it's tricky. It may be tricky to unlock them. And probably the big one I want to spend just a little bit of time now on talking about is council's control plans, okay? Every council's different. Every council's different in how they tackle and how they attack developments. Now, there's obviously some non-refusal standards. There's some elements of each method, whether you're going a duplex, whether you're going multi-dwelling, so townhouses, or whether you're going terraces, or whether you're going some units. There's different non-discretionary standards, things like the block size. So all of a sudden now you can do different types of developments on smaller blocks than you may not have otherwise been able to do. Frontage widths, you've got height limits, you've got floor space ratio. So these particular these key elements, and again, go back and watch some of our previous episodes. We break that down. Just for time's sake, I'm not going to in this episode. But we've got these particular elements that are state reforms. So essentially they supersede council's controls. So, for example, a lot of these are LEP controls. So council will often have a for example, a floor space ratio for a particular site. Let's just say it's a duplex. Most councils, a lot of councils in R2 tend to be around that 50%. Some more, some less, but generally that's around the rule of thumb. Now, all of a sudden, if it's an R2 block, you can go 65% under the reform. So essentially, this new reform, it supersedes what council allowed. The minimum lot size, if it's within this LMR, it supersedes. Height limit, again, it supersedes. But there's a lot of elements of council's controls that do not change, and this is where people are coming unstuck. For example, setbacks. So setbacks, you still need to comply with council's development controls for setbacks. For example, if you're doing multi-dwelling, you need to look at what are the controls for multi-dwelling setbacks. What's the front setback? What's the side setbacks? What's the rear setback? You need to look at landscape. That's a big one. Like Northern Beaches, for example, a lot of areas like Northern Beaches, a lot of people are forgetting that you need a huge amount of landscape in Northern Beaches. So it's all well and good to say you can do 3 townhouses on that site, but once you factor in your landscape, like certain width blocks just will not work. How are you going to manoeuvre vehicles? You still need to comply with the Australian standards for vehicle manoeuvring. You still need to comply. You still need to comply with council with your solar access and with your landscaping and your setbacks, your front, side, rear setbacks, overshadowing, privacy. There's a whole bunch of council constraints. And then it comes down to each particular council. Every council's got its own controls, okay? So although this is a state legislation, this LMR, and there's some key things now that are across the board. So lot size, lot width, height, floor space ratio, those sort of things. From suburb to suburb, from council to council, it's going to look very different in terms of yield because some councils have, for example, a lot of landscape controls. You could have 2 areas within literally a couple of 100 metres of each other, but 2 completely different councils. One site you might be able to get 4 townhouses on and 1 3. So a lot of people they're not applying local knowledge. They're not applying local controls and local constraints to that site because they're only looking at the LMR uplift. They're only looking at the LMR advantages. That's why for me, multi-dwelling, for example, it says there you can go like a 12-metre wide block, but you tell me any site really where you can do multi-dwelling on a 12-metre site. Because let's just say, roughly 5.8, 6 metres you need for your manoeuvring to comply with Australian standards for your vehicles. Then you've got your side setbacks, you've got your driveway, you've got your aisle width, you've got your landscape strip along the boundary. Every council's different there. So before you know it, you've got no width left to work with if you want to do townhouses, for example. So there's just a lot of sites where it just won't work in that capacity. So it might be more of a duplex. But even things like 15-metre wide sites, like in a lot of councils it won't work because some councils you need quite significant setbacks. Like there's one particular council we do a lot of work in where you need to have this is on the side boundary on the first floor. You need to have a 6-metre side setback to a habitable room. On the ground floor, you need 3 metres to a habitable room. And then your landscape controls come into play. So some of these areas that are well located, in some councils you might get 5 townhouses on a site. This particular one you might get 3. Some it just doesn't stack up to do townhouses on. So there's a lot at play. And this is where I'm finding I'm encouraging a lot of people to go down the path of doing good feasibility work on these type of sites. We've been doing a lot of feasibility sketches for clients in these areas purely because you want to give them the confidence. Once you've looked at a few particular areas and you've done a few sketches for that particular council, you start to know what size block you need, what your constraints are, what landscape areas you need. You can really get some good detailed information, so you can really start to get an idea of your yields and your possibilities and your potentials. There's very key things. And again, I'm going to spend a little moment now just discussing why this is key. Before you buy the site, to really get on top of things, you need to understand and know what council you're working in, okay? all of a sudden we've got some councils, especially some of the councils in the northern parts of Sydney, even eastern parts of Sydney, but especially some of the northern parts of Sydney, Northern Beaches and some of those areas where you've not been able to do, for example, multi-dwelling or even dual occupancy in some of these areas. And a lot of councils are not over the moon about it. But also you've got a lot of people in those areas, living in those areas, who are not over the moon about it. So straight away, you have to realise, as an early adopter doing these type of projects and developments, if you are going down that DA pathway, of which most of it needs to be, some can be CDC, but a lot of it needs to go DA at this point in time. You are dealing with councils, some that may not be equipped to deal with volume of work. That's one of the tricky things I've found, that a lot of councils have struggled to keep up with the shortage of town planners and planners within council staff. A lot of councils, there's backlog. And this new reform, the idea is to obviously increase the amount of housing and affordable housing and deal with the housing crisis and deal with the trying to increase our volume of infill housing in New South Wales. I think the problem is a lot of it has to go through council, who are already struggling with bottlenecks. So as a result now, there's going to be some delays. And I think a lot of councils are going to look at these developments with a real fine-tooth comb. That's why it's important to get the right site, to acquire the right site. Just because it's in LMR does not mean it's going to be a great development. Like, you need to go through all the checks. Like, how's the site oriented? That's a big one for me, because if you want to do townhouses, are you going to get sun? Like, I saw a site recently, Northern Beaches, not a bad site, looking okay, could do townhouses, possibly 4. But the problem was the way that there was a couple of trees that I believe can't go. And the problem is you had to run your driveway on the northern side, and then all of a sudden, how are you going to get sun into your living areas? Like, how are you going to deal with some of those solar access elements? How are you going to deal with overshadowing then onto your neighbours? And to get the yield, you need to go 2-story, and there's a whole bunch of things. So orientation plays a huge role. And again, there's 170,000 sites unlocked. A lot of sites purely, I believe, are going to be tricky to unlock due to things like orientation, solar access, privacy, overshadowing. There's a whole bunch of things like that. So if you're looking to really get uplift on a site, you need to make sure that you're getting a site that really works. I'm telling people to make sure you go above and beyond, to make sure you get a site where you can show full compliance, for that the site can be unlocked and that it can be approved. Because although council can't reject a DA, they can't push back on a DA based on those non-discretionary standards of the new code, the new SEP, the LMR, SEP, those things like height, floor space ratio, the lot size, the lot width, a whole car parking, a whole bunch of those controls, floor space. They can push back on things like setbacks, overshadowing, privacy, private open space, landscape area, amenity, streetscape, all these different things that you need to work within council's controls of. You need to show compliance with those things. So although that site may tell you that you can do multi-dwelling on it, you still need to make sure you meet all of council's DCP requirements. So you run a risk if you go in with a whole bunch of variations to the DCP, and this is where good town planning comes into play. Obviously, development controls are there to obviously help control development within that scope or within that area. They're guides that are there when you are designing, when you are executing a project, the design of a project within that neighbourhood, within that area, to ensure that it does fit within the intent of that particular area. So it's very key. And although we've had hundreds of variations over the years, every week we'll prepare variations within reason, but you need to know certain councils, not all councils, but certain councils are not over the moon about, and I'm not saying that to scare people off, but it's important. I always say on this podcast, like, I want to make sure that we're constantly helping people to do thorough due diligence, to have their eyes wide open, and not to go in blind into these type of acquisitions and into these type of projects, because you need to understand that not everyone's over the moon about it. So therefore, if you are looking to do it in an area where multi-dwelling or duplexes have not been possible in the past, just be aware. Be aware of what's happening. Even do some research. If you're looking at a particular street, a particular suburb, do some research. Is there pushback? Go onto community pages and do some research. Has there been pushback? Has there been any sort of pushback from a political level? Look at you can even go back, and I've done a bit of this where I've gone back and looked at council meeting notes. And although it can be pretty boring, if you're serious about development and doing projects, you can go back and look at some of the council meetings that took place where there was discussion around this, and you can look at different papers. You can look at all different sorts of things. Is there community groups? Has there been pushback? Has there been any political pushback? What's that suburb been like in terms of that type of work? And then straight away you might have no-go zones. You might have areas where it's just too much risk. But you may want to go down that path. But just make sure if you do go down that path, you go down with your eyes wide open to what's in front of you and what's ahead of you. So I think that's really key and that's really critical, because the reality is it's exciting. There's so many areas that are now unlocked. But it's also important to understand that you still need to meet council's controls around those particular sites. So orientation for me plays a massive, massive, massive key. Like, orientation can make or break a site, and that's where it can be tricky, because if you're not going to get sun, if you're going into council with a whole bunch of variations and you're relying on those variations being accepted, you're running a high risk, because you're giving not only the neighbours, but you're giving council a lot of grounds to push back and to show why this development is not feasible, or why there's an overdevelopment of that particular site, where there'll be a pushback then to decrease the yield, decrease the volume on that site. Okay, and although you may be fully meeting the SEP criteria under the LMR, the height, the floor space, although you might be fully 100% compliant with that, you still need to make sure that you address in a really articulate and well planned and well documented and well executed way of how you're going to fit within council's controls. Now, it's not to say you can't get variations, because variations can be done within reason, provided that you can execute and you can prove and show and demonstrate, more importantly, how you're able to work within that constraint. But if you're having to go in with a whole number of variations to council's development control plan, just know that you're running heavy risk, okay? You're putting yourself in a tricky position where it could lead to a rejected DA or environment court or something along that manner, okay? So for me, before you go and buy the site, take the time, study council's DCP. Although some councils it's tricky. For myself, that's my industry. I've been in that planning industry for a long, long time, over a couple of decades now. I live in that space. I love that space. I know that space. I get it from an everyday investor, developer, someone who wants to do projects point of view. It's tricky to get your head around, but look, it doesn't hurt to do a bit of your own research to get an understanding. That's why it's important. Don't pick 7 or 8 different council areas. Pick a particular suburb, pick an area, get to know it. Get to know that suburb, get to know that area, get to know what the controls are in that area so that you can become highly specialised in that space. That way you can research the streets, research is there pushback, research that council, research areas where they have pushback, where they have rejected DAs. That's another great one, is to look at where councils have knocked DAs on the head in the past. There could be a particular one. Like a lot of councils, it could be solar access. Okay, you know straight away. there's going to be issues there. Talk to planners, talk to designers, people who've worked within those council areas a lot to determine, is there pet things that council picks on, that council will not stand on? Is there areas where that council will relent? Sometimes there's areas of council's DCPs where they're a little bit more relaxed, where they're open-minded to variations. There's others where it is just a blanket no, that they will push back and back and back against that area. So then you can pick off that low-hanging fruit and you can execute and you can piece together an application that is going to give you the best chance of success. So for me, I'm seeing a whole bunch of people just looking everywhere and anywhere in the LMR areas. The problem is with that, you go in blind because you don't understand, you don't have the knowledge on those areas. You're dealing, even from a planning point of view, and that's obviously my space, design and planning. I know it very well, but in saying that, although I've worked across all of New South Wales, there's not a council I haven't worked in. It's still tricky to drill down and know that without doing often sketches and really to determine what's possible and if it's feasible. So the more you can drill down in a LGA, in an area, the more specialised you'll become. And then there's advantages of that anyway from a development perspective, because you can really get a good, strong understanding of what you could sell the product for, what people are building those products for in similar sites, similar areas, similar specs of builds. You can really just get a little bit, you can drill down a lot more on your numbers. You can see what's happening in the area. You can really get to know what that council's like, how they tick, what they pick on, what they don't pick on, how they think, how they act. And then you can piece together an application. So there's a lot of things at play. Don't just go, I really want to encourage anyone doing projects and passionate about doing something within this LMR. Don't get sucked in to buying the first thing that you see. Don't get sucked into looking at sites that don't work. Don't get sucked in to getting sites where there's going to be high levels of constraints that are going to cause you time delays in council. Don't look at sites that are going to have a huge amount of risk in terms of the constraints, the overlays, the things that have too much risk or you're playing Russian roulette with. It's important to go in smart, go in with your eyes wide open and know that, no, there's not 170,000 properties that are unlocked. There's a whole lot less, and it's about finding the key properties and the good properties that will work. And let's face it, there is a lot of properties that are unbelievable and cracking properties that are waiting to be unlocked, some on the market, some off market, some yet to be discovered that will come available. So I hope this episode's been super helpful for you if you are in that space. Look, if you do know anyone that's in that space or is passionate about the LMR, please share this episode around. Share it with people you know. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.